everybody. Today, we're going to be starting a very fast overview of the rest of the history of the church. From the late Middle Ages, the time period that we often call the Renaissance, through today. A reflection for today is a quote from a saint of this time period, a very famous saint by the name of Saint Joan of Arc. When asked during one of her trials for heresy if she knew whether or not she was in the state of grace in an effort to entrap her, Saint Joan of Arc responded, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may so God keep me." And we echo that in our prayer today. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, trouble began. The 100 Years' War broke out between England and France. This was a war that would transform not only those kingdoms, but the political makeup of Europe. The Black Death, we all know about that, the bubonic plague swept through Europe and wiped out a third of its population, which had major societal impacts. And then the Avignon papacy, more than 70 years where the Pope, still the Bishop of Rome, resided not in Rome, but in Avignon, France. In response to these troubles, of course, God called forth great saints, a good many of them women. Saint Joan of Arc is one of the greatest saints of this time period. She was a young French woman who was a mystic from a very young age. She's best known for leading the French army into battle against the British in the 100 Years' War. After being taken prisoner by the British, she was accused of heresy, falsely, and burned at the stake. But she was later vindicated, and she was canonized by Pope Benedict XV centuries later in 1920. Another of the formidable female saints of this time was Saint Catherine of Siena, who had the fortitude to tell the Pope in Avignon to get back to Rome where he belonged. And he listened. He actually did go back to Rome in response to Saint Catherine. But joy over the return of the Pope did not last long. Next came the extremely confusing Western Schism. Now, this was not a schism like the Great East-West Schism, where the Orthodox broke away from the church by rejecting the authority of the Pope, and similarly, the soon coming Protestant schism. This was actually a schism within the church, where three different men ended up claiming to be Pope at once, each supported by different nations and kingdoms. It was a mess, and it lasted 22 years. Now, that's longer than your lifetime at present. It was a long time. In the end, the matter was resolved at the Council of Constance. Through this council, two of the men were deposed, and one agreed to resign. One man, Pope Martin V, was chosen as Pope and recognized by the whole church. So the problem was solved, but the scandal did tremendous damage to the attitude of the Catholic faithful toward the papacy. And the reality of the Western Schism and the problems that it caused were part of setting the stage for the Protestant schism that was soon to come. On a good note, though, this was the time of the rise of humanism, a movement in art and literature that focused on the richness of the human spirit. Because what do we think of when we hear the word Renaissance, if not art? There was a flowering of art and culture during this time. The humanists revived the study of the great authors of ancient Rome, and there was a renewed interest in the great Greek thinkers. Homer, Aristotle, Plato. Many of their works had been recovered in the East during the time of the Crusades and brought back to the universities of the West. And although this might seem antithetical to the Catholic intellectual tradition, indeed the great Catholic thinkers and artists of this time developed a Christian humanism that put an emphasis on the fact that the human person is made in the image and likeness of God. So in Christian humanism, it is not a matter of glorifying the human person. It's a matter of depicting the goodness and beauty of the human person in very realistic and classic-looking depictions that in turn glorifies God because we are created in his image and likeness. This was the time of the great writer Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, and of Michelangelo, who began painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Another painter commissioned by the Pope at this time was Raphael. On the not-so-great side of things, this time period marked the fall of Constantinople and the end of the Byzantine Empire, which had stood for roughly 1,000 years. On a better note, there was some degree of reunification between some of the churches of the East and the Catholic Church. Efforts were made during the Council of Florence in 1431 to reunite the East and the West. It was not a complete reunification. As we well know, there are Orthodox churches to this very day. But those communions that did reunite, became what are now known as the Eastern Rites of the Catholic Church. There are 24 of them: the Byzantine, the Ukrainian, the Melkite. They're some of the better known ones. Of course, there are the Maronite Rite Catholics who never broke away to begin with. The Eastern Rite churches were exempted, not accepted, exempted from having to adopt the customs of the Latin Rite Church. They retain their own liturgical, theological, and spiritual heritage. And if you ever get the opportunity to learn about any of the Eastern Rite Catholic churches, they are very, very much worth learning about. Finally, toward the end of this time period, intellectual life was undergoing some changes, many of which were not that good. Scholasticism and philosophy toward the end of this time period started to fall into a decline. Scholasticism became far too technical and had declined into quibbling over insignificant details. So theologians and scholars were debating silly questions like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, instead of discussing substantial matters that are relevant to living our lives in the world as Christians and our salvation. Challenges to scholastic thought arose, and some scholars began to debate the relationship of reason to revelation. Now, heretofore, it is not that mankind was unaware of both human reason and revelation. If you go back again to the ancient philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, you go back to the Roman intellectual tradition, of course there was a knowledge of human reason. But in Christian thought, there had always been a marriage, a melding, a harmony between what we know as humans from the world around us, human reason, and divine revelation, what God has made known through the scriptures, through the teachings of Christ, through the teachings of the church. Well, really, in this time period now, we start to see not a break yet, but a little bit of a separation, the beginnings of a separation between understanding of reason and understanding of revelation. William of Ockham, who was not a malicious man, he was an intensely religious Franciscan friar, attempted to simplify the formulation of the faith by separating what he thought could be known by reason alone from what can only be known through revelation. And he founded a school of thought called nominalism, which I'm going to say right off the bat, I have always found to be incredibly confusing, because why on earth would anybody think this way? The idea behind nominalism was that the human mind can only know individual sensible objects and not universal concepts. So it would be as if I were to say, I have a computer mouse in front of me here. You can't see it because you're not seeing me on this video, but I'm using this to change the slides. It would be like if I could say, I can know this computer mouse. It's in front of me. I can see it. I can use it, but I cannot know the general concept of a computer mouse. So I cannot know, if there's any more in the world, if they all work the same. Again, I've always found the fact that people began to think this way to be very interesting, because it makes very little logical sense. From this way of thinking, the next step is to conclude that the truths that God communicates to us through his revelation are now inaccessible to human reason. So you would say, well, we know about the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, three divine persons, one God. We know that through divine revelation. Human reason is not going to come up with that reality, that concept on our own. So what Occam is saying is, because we know it from divine revelation, it's inaccessible to human reason. Not just that human reason can't, originate the idea. Also, from this way of thinking, a conclusion is drawn that something that is right is only right because God says so, and something that is wrong is only wrong because God says so. So the idea being, God said it's wrong to steal, so it's wrong to steal. But God just as easily could have said stealing is a-okay, and if he'd done that, stealing would be a moral good. Again, logic tells us that makes no sense, and yet many live that way in our world today. This set the foundation for the skeptical crisis in metaphysics that would erupt in the 1600s. And the impacts of this crisis are with us to this day. In our next survey of history lesson, where we're going to go from right after the Council of Trent through our time, we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail. Finally, Occam promoted the idea that the church ought to be subordinate to the state, since the state works with reason and the church deals with faith. So he was basically equating faith with a mere subjective idea, although that verbiage actually didn't exist yet. But the idea of matters of faith being subjective, this is really where this begins to originate. Occam, along with men such as John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, set the stage for the revolt and schism that would happen in the next era. Also, it's worth mentioning two other significant events that happened toward the end of this time period. In 1436, the printing press was invented. This changed the world. This changed the way people think. This changed the way people relate to each other. This changed politics. This changed societies. This changed the way people relate to God. We're going to get into it again a little bit more in a future lesson. Also, in 1492, Christopher Columbus embarked on a voyage with 3 ships and 90 men to seek the East by going west, and he ended up making 4 voyages to the Americas. Ta-da! Finally, we're part of this story. I mean, we've been part of this story because a lot of us are of European descent, and our ancestors were part of everything that was going on in Europe, although I realize that is not 100% universal. But we're here, we're Americans, we're in this country, and finally, the story comes to our shores, and we'll follow it a little bit. Although many modern people adore maligning this man, the true story of his voyages and his intentions in making them are actually quite fascinating and eye-opening to those who are willing to look beyond the popular narrative. And again, I really do encourage you to do so, because there is a lot to be learned from this history. In any case, his voyages opened up a brand new chapter in the history of the church, as missionaries would soon journey to these shores to preach the gospel. All right, that is the end of video number 1. Please go on to video number 2, where I will talk about the Protestant Schism and the Council of Trent.